A fist came down on the steering wheel. Then again. The old station wagon just sat there dead in the cold morning. A woman turned the key one more time. Click. Nothing. Her breath fogged up the windshield. Across the street, a screen door banged open. Heavy boots came down the porch steps, crossed the frozen grass, and stopped beside her window. A big man. Gray beard, leather vest, thick arms, big hands. He tapped the glass with one knuckle. She rolled the window down 2 inches, unsure of him. He said, "Pop the hood." That man was Dutch Kowalski, and 20 years back he'd have scared half this street just by walking down it. What he did in that driveway over the next 4 hours would leave a leaner prude crying at her kitchen sink by midnight. Nobody saw it coming. Not even him. Stay with me on this one. Now you have to understand who this man was. Dutch Kowalski was 68 years old, and for most of his life he'd been a Hell's Angel, not a weekend rider, not a man who bought a leather jacket at 50 and posted pictures of it. The real thing. 30 years on the road, patches earned in ways he didn't talk about, a body that had been broken and stitched back together more times than he could count. He'd buried more friends than most men ever make. And 2 winters ago, he'd buried his wife, Carol, right here in Marysville, Ohio, in the little cemetery behind the Methodist church. He never once set foot inside. Since then, Dutch had lived alone on Cedar Lane. He kept to himself. He fixed things in his garage. He drank his coffee black on the porch every morning, watching the street wake up, and he nodded to the neighbors who nodded back and said nothing to the ones who crossed to the other sidewalk when they saw him coming. He was used to that. A man who looks like a storm gets treated like one. But here's the thing about Dutch. Underneath all that leather and all those years, there was a man who couldn't stand to see something broken and not fix it. And that morning, watching the widow across the street pound her steering wheel and put her face in her hands, something in his chest just wouldn't let him stay on his porch. Alina Prout was 66. She taught 4th grade at Marysville Elementary for 31 years before she retired, and half the town had learned to read at her table. She was small, silver-haired, the kind of woman who still wore a cardigan buttoned to the top and kept peppermints in her purse. Her husband, Raymond, had passed 4 years back. Heart attack, quick, no warning. One morning he was there and the next he was gone, and Alina had learned to live inside a house that had grown too big and too quiet. She and Dutch had lived across the street from each other for close to 20 years, and in all that time they'd exchanged maybe a dozen words. A wave. A morning. Once, a nod at the mailbox. That was it. She was the school teacher and he was the biker, and there was a whole invisible fence between those 2 things that neither of them had ever thought to climb. So when Dutch said pop the hood, Alina didn't move for a second. She just looked at him. This enormous man in a leather vest, breath steaming in the cold, standing at her window like he'd stepped out of a nightmare or a movie. And then she saw his eyes. And his eyes were tired and kind, and something in them told her it was all right. So she pulled the little lever and the hood popped, and Dutch lifted it up and leaned in. He was quiet for a long time in there. She could hear him working, muttering to himself, tapping and turning. Finally he came back around and wiped his hands on a rag he'd pulled from his back pocket. "Your carburetor's shot," he said. "This thing's what, a 78? 1981, Alina said. "Raymond bought it new. I never had the heart to sell it." Dutch nodded slow, like that meant something to him. "Well, the good news is I can fix it. Bad news is it's gonna take me the better part of the day. You got somewhere to be." Alina almost laughed. "Not in 4 years," she said. And then she looked embarrassed she'd said it, but Dutch didn't laugh at her. He just nodded again. "Then let's not rush it," he said. And he went back to his garage to get his tools. That was how it started, not with anything grand. Just a broken car and a cold morning and a man who couldn't walk away from it. He set up a folding stool in her driveway, laid out his wrenches on a towel and got to work. And Alina, who had planned to spend that day the way she spent all her days, alone with the television and a crossword, instead found herself pulling on her coat and bringing him a cup of coffee. He took it black. Of course he did. Now most people would have stopped at "I'll fix your car." Most people would have dropped in a part and driven off. But Dutch didn't have a part. He had to rebuild the whole thing by hand, piece by greasy piece. And he did it right there in her driveway while the October sky stayed gray and the wind came down off the fields. And Alina, instead of going back inside, pulled a lawn chair out of her garage and sat down beside him. And they started to talk. You have to remember, these two had lived across a street from each other for 20 years and never once really talked. So there was a lot of ground to cover. She told him about Raymond, about the classroom, about the students who still sent her Christmas cards. He told her about Carol, about the road, about the long haul out to the coast he used to make every spring. She asked him if it was true what they said about men like him, and he asked her what they said, and she blushed and wouldn't tell him, and he laughed for the first time in a long time. Hours went by. The coffee turned into sandwiches. The sandwiches turned into a second pot of coffee. And Dutch's hands moved the whole time, cleaning jets, seating gaskets, adjusting a little screw a half turn at a time. He was good at this. Better than good. The kind of good that comes from a lifetime of keeping old machines alive because you couldn't afford new ones. And Alina watched those big scarred hands do delicate work, and something in her, something that had been asleep for 4 years, began to stir. Around 3 in the afternoon, the light was starting to go. Dutch wiped down the last piece, dropped it into place, and tightened the final bolt. He stood up and his knees cracked and he groaned like an old door. "All right," he said. "Moment of truth. Get in there and give her a try." Alina climbed into the driver's seat. Her hand was actually shaking a little and she didn't know why. She turned the key. The engine caught on the first try. It rumbled to life, steady and smooth, purring like it hadn't purred in years. Alina let out a laugh that was almost a sob, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. Dutch slammed the hood down and stepped back, and there was a grin buried somewhere in that gray beard. "There she is," he said. "Good for another 20 years." Alina got out of the car. She came around to where he stood wiping the grease from his hands with that old rag, and she looked up at him, this mountain of a man who'd given her his whole day and asked for nothing. And she meant to just say thank you. That's all she meant to say. But what came out was something else. She tilted her head, and a little smile crossed her face, half teasing and half something sadder, and she said, "Dutch Kowalski. Where was that Harley of yours and that big heart 20 years ago, when I was young and lonely and living right across this street?" She said it as a joke. She said it light, the way you say a thing that scares you a little. And then she laughed and shook her head and picked up his empty coffee cup off the driveway and told him to come by any time he wanted a decent meal. Dutch laughed too. He said something about being 20 years too slow his whole life. He gathered up his wrenches, folded his towel, and walked back across the street in the fading light. He waved once at his door. She waved back from hers. And that should have been the end of it. A nice day, a fixed car, 2 lonely people who'd finally spoken. Dutch went inside his quiet house, hung his vest on the hook by the door the way he always did, and put a pot on the stove for a can of soup. He sat down in his chair. The house was still. The furnace clicked on. Outside, the streetlight came up over Cedar Lane. Everything was calm. Everything was ordinary. He even smiled to himself, thinking about the way she teased him. Where was your Harley 20 years ago? He shook his head and reached for the TV remote. And then he stopped. Because something about what she'd said had snagged on the back of his mind, like a hook you don't feel go in until you try to pull away. 20 years ago, young and lonely, right across this street. Dutch set the remote down. He sat very still for a moment. And then slow, like a man walking toward something he wasn't sure he wanted to find, He got up out of his chair and went down the hall to the closet where he kept the boxes he never opened. He knew the one. It was a cigar box, the corners worn soft, held shut with a rubber band that had gone brittle years ago. Carol used to tease him about it. His box of ghosts, she called it. Old photographs, a few from the road, a few from before. Pictures of men who were dead now in places that didn't exist anymore. He hadn't opened it since before Carol got sick. He carried it back to the kitchen table and sat down under the yellow light. He peeled off the rubber band and it snapped and crumbled in his fingers. He lifted the lid, and there they were. His whole life in a stack of curling paper. He turned them over one at a time. Him at 25, lean and dangerous, standing next to a chopper he'd sold in '82. Him and a crew of men in the desert. Carol, young and laughing, her hair blowing across her face. He had to stop on that one for a while, but he kept going, because something was pulling him. And near the bottom of the box, stuck to the back of another photo, was one he'd almost forgotten he had. He worked it loose with his thumbnail, and when he turned it over and held it up to the light, his heart just about stopped in his chest, because this one changed everything. Now here's where it turns, so stay close. The photograph was old. The colors had gone soft and orange the way they do. It was a summer day, sometime back in the early '70s, a roadside diner off Route 33 with a gravel lot full of bikes and cars. Dutch remembered that day. It had been a rally run, 30 guys stopping to eat, and somebody had a camera and made everybody pose. There he was, front and center, 22 years old, no gray in his beard, one boot up on his front tire, grinning like he owned the whole world. But that wasn't what stopped him. What stopped him was the girl. Off to the side of the photo, half in the frame, was a young waitress in a diner apron, carrying a tray of drinks out to a table on the patio. She'd been caught by accident just passing through the shot. Slim, dark-haired, maybe 18, with a face turned slightly toward the camera. And Dutch knew that face. He'd know it anywhere. He just spent the whole day looking at an older version of it across a lawn chair in a driveway. It was a leaner. He held the photo an inch from his nose. His hands, those steady hands that could rebuild a carburetor blind, were shaking now. It was her. 50 years younger, before Raymond, before the classroom, before any of it. A teenage waitress at a diner off Route 33, and a 22-year-old outlaw who'd stopped there for a burger and a Coke and never even noticed the girl carrying his drink. Their paths had crossed. Half a century ago, in a gravel lot in the middle of nowhere, they had stood 20 feet apart, and neither one had ever known. Now stop and think about that for a second. Because I need you to feel the weight of it, the way Dutch felt it, sitting alone at that kitchen table. Two people who ended up living across a street from each other for 20 years. Two people who each married someone else and loved them and buried them. Two people who found each other only now, at the very end of the road, when they were old and gray and worn down by loss. And it turned out the universe had put them in the same photograph 50 years ago. Their whole lives, they'd been circling each other. And they never knew. Dutch put the photo down on the table and pressed his hands over his mouth. And this big man, this outlaw, this man who'd buried half the people he ever loved and never once let anybody see him cry, sat there in his quiet kitchen with his eyes filling up, staring at a photograph of a girl he'd walked right past when he was young enough to have changed everything. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one, the true ones about ordinary people and the things that quietly break your heart, that's all I do here. Stick around, because what Dutch did the very next morning is the part you're going to remember. He barely slept. He lay in his bed with the photo on the nightstand and watched the ceiling until the sky went gray. And somewhere in the middle of that long night, he made up his mind about something. He didn't have the words for it yet, but he knew he wasn't going to let another 20 years go by. He'd already wasted 50. A man only gets so many chances to fix the thing that's broken, and Dutch had spent his whole life fixing everybody's but his own. So the next morning, before the sun was even properly up, he got dressed. He put on a clean shirt, the one he saved for funerals, which tells you how few good occasions he'd had. He picked up the photograph, and he walked out onto his porch to cross the street. And that's when he saw it. Planted in the middle of Alina Prutt's front lawn, hammered into the frozen ground sometime during the night, was a sign. For sale. Dutch stood on his porch and the photo went limp in his hand, and the cold went right through him in a way the October morning never could. For sale. She was leaving. He didn't understand it. She hadn't said a word about it yesterday. They'd talked for 6 hours and she'd never once mentioned she was selling her house. But there it was, bright red letters, a realtor's smiling face. And underneath it, a little rider that made his stomach drop even further. Open house Sunday. Sunday. That was 3 days away. Now the whole thing had changed. It wasn't about whether he had the nerve to knock on her door and show her an old photograph anymore. It was about time running out. It was about a woman who was packing up 20 years of her life across the street, who might be gone before he ever got the courage to say the thing he needed to say. And Dutch Kowalski knew, better than almost anyone alive, what it felt like to be 20 years too late. He shoved the photo in his shirt pocket and crossed the street so fast he nearly slipped on the frost. He went up her walk and knocked on her door, harder than he meant to. It took a minute. Then the curtain moved and the deadbolt turned, and Alina opened the door in her robe, surprised to see him. Behind her in the front room he could see it. Cardboard boxes, newspaper, half the shelves already bare. She really was leaving. "Dutch," she said, "is everything all right?" And Dutch, who had rehearsed nothing, who had no idea what he was going to say, just pointed past her at the boxes and said, "You're moving." Alina's face fell a little. She stepped back and let him in, and she pulled her robe tighter and she told him. Her daughter, Susan, lived out in Columbus. She'd been after Alina for a couple of years now to come live with her and the grandkids. The house was too big. The winters were too long. The money from selling would help. And after 4 years alone in these rooms, Alina had finally, just last week, said yes. The realtor came Tuesday. The sign went up last night. She was supposed to be out by the end of the month. "I meant to tell you yesterday," she said quietly, "but we were having such a nice time, and I didn't want to." Dutch stood in the middle of her half-packed living room, this enormous man surrounded by cardboard boxes, and for a long moment he couldn't say anything at all. And then he reached into his shirt pocket, and he pulled out the photograph, and his hand was shaking again. "I need to show you something," he said, "and I need you to sit down for it." Alina looked at him, confused, but she sat. She lowered herself onto the arm of her sofa, and she held out her hand, and Dutch gave her the photo. She looked at it. And at first she just saw what anybody would see, a bunch of rough young men and their motorcycles outside an old diner. She smiled a little and she said, "Is this you? Look at all that hair." "Keep looking," Dutch said. His voice had gone thick. "Look at the side by the patio." And Alina looked. She brought the photo closer to her face. And Dutch watched it happen, watched the exact moment she saw it, watched 50 years fall away from her all at once. Her lips parted. Her hand came up to her chest. And in a whisper that barely made it out, she said, "That's the Route 33 diner. I worked there. The summer I was 18, right before I met Raymond." "I know," Dutch said. "I was there. I was sitting at one of your tables and I didn't even know it." "Alina, that's you carrying my drink out. That's you. 50 years ago. We were in the same place at the same time when we were kids, and I've had this picture in a box in my closet for half a century, and I never once looked close enough to see you in it." Alina didn't say anything. She just stared at the photograph, at the ghost of her own young face, tears sliding down over the lines of it now, dropping onto the old paper. "Yesterday," Dutch said, and he had to stop and breathe. "Yesterday you asked me where my Harley was 20 years ago, where my big heart was, and I laughed it off. But Alina, I've been trying to answer that question all night, and the truth is my Harley was right there. 50 years ago it was parked 20 feet from you. I've spent my whole life a stone's throw from you and I kept missing it. I missed it at that diner. I missed it for 20 years across this street. And now you've got a sign in your yard, and I'll be damned if I'm gonna miss it one more time." He got down. This big old broken-kneed man got down on one knee on her living room floor, not to propose. He'd tell her later. He wasn't fool enough to think that, but just to be level with her, just to look her in the eye where she sat. "I'm not asking you to stay for me," he said. "You go to your daughters if that's what's right. I'd never stand in the way of you and those grandkids. But before you put one more thing in a box, I needed you to know. I needed you to know that out of all the streets in all the towns in this whole country, we ended up across from each other. Twice. 50 years apart. That's not nothing, Alina. In my whole life I've never believed in much of anything, but I can't look at that picture and tell you that's nothing." Alina Prout sat on the arm of her sofa with a photograph shaking in her hands and cried the way you cry when something you buried a long time ago comes back to life. And then she reached out, and she put her small hand against the side of that big rough face, and she said the thing that Dutch would remember for the rest of his days. She said, "Then why don't you go get your Harley and take an old woman for a ride before she leaves?" So he did. He went back across the street, and he pulled the tarp off the Harley he hadn't started in 2 years, the one he'd bought with Carol's blessing and hadn't had the heart to ride since she passed. He checked the oil and the plugs, and he kicked it over, and after 2 years the old engine coughed and caught and roared to life, just the way Alina's station wagon had the day before. Turns out Dutch Kowalski could bring just about anything back from the dead if he cared to. He rode it up her driveway. He handed her Carol's old helmet, the little one, and he helped her buckle it under her chin with fingers that fumbled the strap. And Alina Prout, 66 years old, retired schoolteacher, in her good coat over her nightgown because she couldn't wait long enough to change, climbed onto the back of a Hell's Angels motorcycle and wrapped her arms around his middle and held on. And they rode. Out of Cedar Lane, past the school where she'd taught for 31 years, out onto the county roads with the fields all cut down for winter and the sky gone bright and blue overhead. She pressed her cheek against his back and she laughed and she cried at the same time, and the wind took it all away behind them. They rode all the way out to Route 33, and the diner was long gone, torn down decades back, just an empty gravel lot with weeds coming up through it. But they stopped there anyway. Dutch cut the engine, and they sat there together in the quiet where the two of them had stood 50 years before and never known it. Alina didn't sell the house. I'll tell you how it went, because you've come this far and you've earned the ending. She called her daughter Susan that same night, and she told her the whole story, the car and the photograph and the diner and the ride. And Susan, who thought her mother had gone a little soft in the head, drove up from Columbus that weekend to see this biker for herself. And she came ready to disapprove. She came ready to protect her mother from some rough old man who turned her head. But then she watched him. She watched Dutch fix the loose railing on her mother's porch without being asked. She watched him warm up Alina's car for her so she wouldn't have to sit in the cold. She watched the way her mother laughed, really laughed, in a way Susan hadn't heard since her father died. And on Sunday morning, before she drove back to Columbus, Susan walked out to the front yard, and she pulled the FOR sale sign out of the frozen ground with her own 2 hands, and she carried it around to the garage and leaned it against the wall where nobody would see it. "You stay, Mom," she said. "You stay right here." Dutch and Alina took it slow after that. They were old, and they'd both been married before, and they knew better than to rush the little time they had left. He never did move in, not for a long while anyway. But he was over there every morning for coffee, and she was on the back of that Harley every Sunday the weather allowed, and the whole of Cedar Lane got used to the sight of the school teacher and the biker sitting out on her porch swing in the evenings, her hand in his big scarred one, not saying much, just watching the streetlight come up. The neighbors who used to cross to the other sidewalk when they saw Dutch coming, they stopped doing that. It's hard to be afraid of a man once you've seen him the way Alina saw him. Once you know that underneath all the leather, there's just a fellow who couldn't stand to leave a thing broken. They got married the following spring in the little cemetery church he'd never set foot in, with Susan and the grandkids in the front row and a whole row of gray-bearded men in leather vests filling up the back. Alina wore blue. Dutch wore the shirt he saved for funerals because it was the only good one he had, and he figured it was finally getting a happy day out of it. He framed the photograph, the one from the diner. He hung it in the front hall of the house on Cedar Lane, right where you'd see it walking in, two kids 50 years apart from the people they'd become, standing 20 feet away from a whole different life. And under it, on a little card, he wrote just 4 words in his rough block letters. Never too late, ever. They had 6 good years together before Dutch's heart finally gave out, sitting in his chair on the porch on a warm evening with Alina's hand in his. 6 years. Not a lifetime, but more than either of them had ever thought they'd get. And Alina will tell you to this day, if you catch her out on that porch, that those 6 years were worth more than all the ones that came before, because those were the years she stopped being lonely. So think about that widow on a cold October morning, pounding her fist on a steering wheel in a car that wouldn't start. She thought it was the worst morning she'd had in years. She had no idea it was the morning her whole life turned around. And think about the big man on the porch across the street, who could have stayed in his chair with his coffee and let it be somebody else's problem. He didn't. He got up and he crossed the street and he said, "Pop the hood." And that one small thing, that one bit of kindness from a man everybody was afraid of, cracked open 2 hearts that had already given up on being happy. It really is never too late. Not for the thing that was always right there. Not for the love that spent 50 years waiting for you to finally look close enough to see it. Sometimes it's parked 20 feet away your whole life. Sometimes it's just across the street. And all it takes is one cold morning, and one broken-down car, and one man who won't leave a thing broken to bring it all the way home.